Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023-2024 program, It's Complicated. These year's sessions seek to reclaim the phrase "it's complicated" as a tool for unraveling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. To this end, today we host an It's Complicated panel discussion on restitution. We would like to warmly welcome our panel speakers, Anne Hollmuller, Gracia Luanzo-Casongo, and Charlotte Woodhead. Anne Hollmuller is a doctoral candidate in the Institute of French Studies and the Department of History at the New York University, writing a dissertation regarding the French debate over restitution. Last year, she served as a public humanities doctoral fellow at the René and Sham Gross Foundation, researching their African arts collection. Gracia Luanzo-Casongo is a doctoral student at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium and a member of the Institute of Political Science, Louvain, Europe. She's a legal scholar and political scientist and has been a member of the American Bar Association. Charlotte Woodhead is an associate professor at Warwick Law School. She works with a broad field of cultural heritage law, with a particular interest in repatriation, restitution, and the ethics of care. We shall begin with Anne's presentation, followed by Charlotte's, and then Gracia's. Anne's topic today will be dissing on recent French restitutions and the challenges of objects and ancestral return. Welcome, Anne. Whenever you're ready, please take the floor.
Can everyone see my presentation and hear my voice? Excellent. Thank you to the organizers for hosting this wonderful series of talks throughout the semesters, and thank you to Isabella for moderating this event. So I'll get started. The name of my talk is D'ici cinq ans, Recent French Restitutions and the Challenges of Object and Ancestral Return, and I'll get started. On November 28, 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron gave an address to a crowded auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou in the capital, Burkina Faso. Within this lengthy address, the recently elected leader described his remedies for resetting the relationship between France and the African continent. Among the provisions for which Macron advocated was the restitution of cultural heritage, saying, "I cannot accept that a large share of several African countries' cultural heritage be kept in France. There are historical explanations for it, but there is no valid, lasting, and unconditional justification. African heritage cannot exist solely in private collections and European museums. African heritage must be showcased in Paris, but also in Dakar, Lagos, and Cotonou. This will be one of my priorities. Within 5 years, I want the conditions to exist for temporary or permanent returns of African heritage to Africa." This presidential declaration was the result of years of work by activists to draw attention to this issue and help draw international interest to a question that had long been the preserve of people like us, museum curators, graduate students, cultural activists, engaged intellectuals, and Indigenous communities. It helped set off new conversations around the globe regarding this problem and was followed up by important steps. In fall 2018, 2 researchers commissioned by the president, Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, released their famous report with its radical recommendations for French museums, which set off another round of important conversations around the globe. The co-authors envisioned return as a means of repairing painful memories and establishing a new relational ethic based on a more equal distribution of culture. In the last several years, France has returned or promised to return several sets of objects and human remains to nations in Francophone Africa, including Senegal, Algeria, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and Madagascar. Yet the process of realizing these returns has illustrated the complexity and the fraught political reality of actualizing returns, as diplomatic and geopolitical considerations have compromised the promise of collaborative and research-informed procedures. This presentation will discuss 3 case studies drawn from research for my dissertation project, Le Grand Retour, French Cultural Politics and the Long History of Restitution, 1993 to 2022. The first of these is the return of the saber associated with El Hajj Omar Tall, an Islamic scholar and anti-imperial fighter whose sword was returned to Senegal in November 2019 during a ceremony attended by then French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe. The enmeshment of this return in the relations between France and Senegal, and the later emergence of additional conflicting information about the object's history, illustrate the challenges posed by a lack of provenance information and by the persisting logics of Franco-African entanglement. My second case study is that of Algerian human remains, said to be those of 19th century anti-colonial resistance, which were returned to Algiers on July 5, 2020. The bitterness generated by this return, as more information later emerged about the real identities of these ancestors, menaced future returns, and the lack of clarity highlighted the need for more rigorous research and a more comprehensive policy for French-held human remains. The third case study is that of the treasures of Béhanzin, returned to the Republic of Benin in the fall of 2021, which illustrates a more consensual and collaborative process that still, however, demonstrated France's tight control over the process of return. El Hajj Omar Tall was an Islamic scholar and military leader who founded the Tukulor Empire, a kingdom that grew to encompass much of Senegal, Guinea, and Mali during the second half of the 19th century. The ambitions of Tall and his realm brought him into conflict with French colonial authorities, who sought to expand their reach deeper into the continent, and the two sides spent decades in conflict, with Omar's son Amadou taking up the mantle after his father's death in 1864. The empire collapsed in the early 1890s as French troops under General Louis Archinard pursued Amadou through the remnants of the kingdom. In April 1890, Archinard sacked the capital of Ségou, plundering the precious jewels, weapons, and manuscripts that Omar Tall and his family had gathered in the city's royal palaces. Pursuing Amadou to Bandiagara, Archinard took that city on April 23rd and seized more treasures of the fallen empire. In 1909, the general donated the saber to the Musée de l'Armée at Les Invalides, one of several collecting institutions enriched by the souvenirs of the general's colonial pillaging. The sword, researchers later saw, was of European manufacture, forged by Coulot and Company in Alsace sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and it remains unknown how it arrived from Europe into the hands of the Tukulor fighters. But since 1994, descendants of Omar Tall had sought the restitution of items and the digitization of manuscripts seized by Archinard, to no avail. Despite funding their own research trips to visit the objects and volumes in France, the Omarian family was not heard out until Felwinsar and Benedict Savoy spoke with them to discuss the longer history of their claim. The weapon had, however, twice returned to Senegal in 1998 and 2008 in the form of loans to the Ifan museums in Dakar, and was on a year-long loan to the new Musée des Civilisations Noires in Dakar, following its opening on December 6, 2018. A formal ceremony effectuating the saber's permanent return to Senegal took place on November 17, 2019. Present at the occasion was the President of Senegal, Macky Sall, and the Prime Minister of France, Edouard Philippe, who was in Dakar for a two-day state visit and was accompanied by 6 ministers, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, and the Minister of Armies, Florence Parly, as well as 7 French parliamentarians. The meeting happened to include the signing of 7 agreements between Dakar and Paris, including those on development funding, a new cultural cooperation, regional rail planning, and 2 sales of armaments to Senegal, of 3 French patrol boats and a number of European-made missiles. The meeting was held in the framework of a recurring Forum de Dakar sur la paix et la sécurité en Afrique, a Franco-Senegalese cooperation which focused on security in the Sahel region. At that time, France remained the largest investor in Senegal, and Philippe's visit underscored French geostrategic priorities for the two nations, even during the ceremony meant to commemorate the returning of the saber. Philippe used his address at the handover to discuss the other agreements signed during those 2 days in Dakar, and their importance for the futures of France, Senegal, and the Sahel, and the goal of preventing terror and violence from spreading across the region. However, Philippe also digressed into a discussion of his admiration for historical weaponry. As he put it, I have a particular connection with sabers. I have one that follows me everywhere, in my different offices, including my current one. It is the most noble of weapons, one of command, one of responsibility. Felwine Sarr, co-author of the Sarr-Savoy report, was present at the ceremony and was not particularly impressed. He wrote in a Facebook post and later told an interviewer that the Prime Minister's speech did not meet the gravity at the moment, going off topic and lacking the respect and solemnity which other speakers had exhibited. More troubling than Philippe's poor political performance was the nature of the French return, which came in the form of a 5-year loan until a law could be passed that would enable a permanent and legally authorized rendering of the sword to Senegal. Some people were likely assured by Sarre's promise in the same post that the sword would never return to Paris, but others who opposed restitution or who defended French heritage law were unlikely to be appeased. This technique had been used to go around the law before, in the case of several hundred manuscripts returned by France to South Korea in 2012, and those items had never returned to Seoul. For all those returned from Seoul, for all those concerned, the question was brought to an end on December 24th, 2020, when a law of exception was passed in France, formally and permanently returning the saber to Senegal. There remained one other problem. Some experts were concerned about the authenticity of the historical connection between this sword and Omartal. At the time of the return, historian Francis Simonis argued in Le Monde that no local or European historical source had ever mentioned a similar weapon in the possession of the leader, and that confusion about the date and site of the object's acquisition made the attribution uncertain. Later, further research conducted by Lucio Parafanaris, a provenance researcher at the Musée de l'Armée, suggested that the sword had indeed probably not belonged to the legendary leader himself, but to one of his sons or allies. The saber remains on display at the Musée des Civilisations Noires in Dakar, a treasured reminder of a fallen empire nonetheless. A second instance of return during the first Macron administration, next slide, was the repatriation on July 5th, 2020, of human remains to Algeria. These skulls had been rediscovered in March 2011 at the Museum of Natural History in Paris by Algerian archaeologist and historian Ali Farid Belkadi, while he was performing research on a French military doctor who had worked and collected in Algeria during the conquest of that territory. Following what he called a monstrous discovery which spoke volumes about colonial barbarism, Belkadi began a years-long crusade for the return of these remains to their nation of origin, with a series of pleas and petitions to presidents on both sides of the Mediterranean. This crusade was endorsed by Algerian intellectuals in July 2016 in an editorial in Le Monde. They advocated for the return of the remains. These writers were aware of the fraught political stakes of the Algerian war and colonization in French memory, but argued that Algerian remains should be returned just as those of some Maori and Kanak ancestors had already been, as a matter of justice and fairness. Following Macron's inauguration to the presidency, Belkadi wrote to the new French leader on May 15, 2017, and the president did announce himself in favor of such a return that December, although in exchange he sought something from Algerian authorities, a more favorable treatment of the Harkis, Algerians who had served as French auxiliaries during the Algerian War of Independence or before, and their children, who cannot or cannot easily return to the land of their birth. Such a bargain does not appear to have been achieved, but the French gesture was forthcoming nevertheless. On July 3rd, 2020, the remains returned to Algeria, where the honored dead were celebrated as valiant resistance fighters who had battled against French colonialism. The 24 skulls were then interred on July 5th, 2020, the 58th anniversary of the nation's independence from France. While these ancestors could finally rest in peace, the living continued to quarrel. The remains had been returned in the framework of a renewable 5-year loan and remain the property of France, although they would certainly never return to Paris from Algerian soil. An article in the New York Times in October 2022 revealed that the return process had been warped by a lack of collections transparency, as well as by the urgency of political interests. Documents obtained by the Times found that while 6 of the skulls belonged to resistance fighters, the rest of the 24 were not, or were of indeterminate origin. A commission which had been intended to study the return had not finished their work before Macron's government decided to forgo further research and move ahead with the return so it could take place on July 5th, and thereby help cultivate better Franco-Algerian relations. French senators Catherine Morin-Desailly and Pierre Ouzoulias, who had long worked on the restitution of objects and remains, resented the use of these ancestors as olive branches, and Morin-Desailly demanded answers from the Minister of Culture. Yet the news that these human remains were not all those of anti-colonial fighters was not as shocking as one might suppose. Bruno David, the director of the museum, had said in January 2018 that only 7 of the skulls were undoubtedly those of resistance, while others were likely Algerian allies of the French or the remains of Algerian criminal offenders. The problem was that these remains had been described by Algerian and French officials and in the press at the time of their return as being those of anti-colonial martyrs, and the true history compromised for political purposes. Still, the stories that could be verified of the skull and death of Sheikh Bouziane, killed by the French in 1849, or of Mohammed Lamjad ben Abdel Malik, killed in 1854, were testimony to the brutality of the French and of the need to return these remains to their home soil. That more information could not be definitively established regarding other remains, and that both governments had valued the political importance of this return over other considerations, did not alter the fact that these ancestors did not belong in a museum. But both France and Algeria had taken Belkadi's hope of doing justice to the dead and transformed it into a means of forwarding reconciliation, and Harki soldiers and resistance heroes now mingled beneath Algerian soil. The third return of the treasures of Béhanzin marked a less intellectually compromised process, as previous collaborations between curators and researchers in France and the Republic of Benin had allowed for years of intense and productive research upon the history and artistic importance of the items involved. This restitution, however, was still conducted according to the will of the French, and some criticized the partial nature of the return, which did not include one particularly important item, the iron statue of the war god Gu. The treasures of Béhanzin were seized in 1892 by French forces following the fall of the Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is today the Republic of Benin. Donated by General Alfred Amédée Dodds to the National Collections, the items included 3 statues of the final Dahomeyan kings, which were displayed for decades in successive French museums as treasured spoils of war. Another notable piece seized from Dahomey during the conflict was an iron statue of the god of war, Gu, seized at Cana by a Colonel Eugène Fonsagrive, and attributed to the artist Akadi Ekvekendo. Made of recycled metal, including very likely slave chains, this piece was a particularly prized item. It was described in 1912 by Guillaume Apollinaire, appeared in the landmark show African Negro Art at MoMA in 1935, and is now displayed at the Pavillon des Sessions in the Musée du Louvre, representing the final consecration of this item as a masterpiece of world art. The other items seized in Dahomey came to reside in the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, and some of these were on display at the museum since its opening in 2006. In 2013, however, the Conseil Représentatif des Associations Noires, or CRON, began a protest movement for the return of these objects to their native soil. They hosted a guided tour of looted objects at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, inviting assembled journalists to view the looted items and publishing an editorial in Le Monde calling for their return. Between 2013 and 2016, this organization worked to gain the endorsement of the government of Benin and the descendants of the Dahomeyan royal family for this restitution claim, and its leaders celebrated as a victory Emmanuel Macron's address at Ouagadougou and his radical promises. Following the release of the Savoir report in November 2018, the French president announced the immediate return of the treasures of Béhanzin to the Republic of Benin. Due no doubt in part to the coronavirus pandemic, the return of these items was delayed until the fall of 2021. The treasures of Béhanzin were given a final exhibition at the Quai Branly, from which this image is taken, showing the 3 royal sculptures, the throne of Cana and the throne of Gezo, the doors of the palace of Glele, and other regalia, clothing, and religious items, which would now return after over 130 years' absence from their nation of origin. In Cotonou, the capital city of Benin, the 26 returned objects were placed on display in a special exhibition at the Presidential Palais de la Marina, in concert with the work of 34 contemporary artists from Benin. The extremely popular exhibition attracted audiences young and old from across the country to view both the historic treasures and works by modern artists. A notable exception to the return of Dahomey's treasures was the fate of the Dieu Gu, who remained in the Musée du Louvre and which the French were unwilling to return. This state of affairs did not please Patrice Talon, the president of Benin, who sought the return of the Iron God and objected to the fact that France was able to pick and choose which objects would be returned. He said this both in Paris, at this press conference with the French president, and at a speech in Cotonou, welcoming the other works back home. And he vowed to return to France for more artworks that showcased the artistic genius of Benin's ancestral talents. While Benin had achieved the return of some of its treasures, as well as millions of euros in French financial support for a new museum to showcase them, the nation still longed for a return on its own terms, with objects of its choosing. These 3 returns illustrate how the political salience of this issue has repeatedly come into conflict with the need for further research and the desire to work in a more just and equal collaboration. For all of Macron's efforts to reset relationships relations between France and much of Francophone Africa have actually steadily deteriorated over the past several years, as military coups d'etat, including in Burkina Faso, have come to power in part by channeling anti-French sentiment. If France is cultivated through these acts of cultural symbolism, its relationships with Patrice Talon and Macky Sall, it is worth noting that both of these leaders have shown increasingly anti-democratic tendencies over the past several years. And much more remains to be done to heal relationships between France and Algeria, and within France over Algeria, before the memory of conflict and colonization can be healed. In the future, perhaps new returns will help to build new and more equal relationships between France and the continent. But the wounds of the past persist in the inequalities of the present, and much more work needs to be done to build that new relational ethic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you for this. We will now move to Charlotte's presentation. Charlotte will be talking about the complications of the language of restitution, repatriation, and return, masking power, authority, justice, and remembrance. Charlotte, whenever you're ready, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for organising this series of events. What I'm going to be talking about today is really the complexity of language when it comes to restitution, repatriation, return. And those aren't the only terms, there are plenty more as well, which I'll talk about. And the importance of language really struck me a number of years ago when I was presenting at a conference, when a colleague who was an international lawyer presented and made use of the terminology of return, stating that restitution has a very specific meaning in international law, and for that reason was going to be using the terminology of return. The next day, I made my presentation, and I too said that I was going to be using the more neutral language of return on the basis that from a private law point of view, restitution has a very specific legal meaning. It's the unravelling or the response to an unjust enrichment at somebody else's expense. And so for that reason, I was using the terminology of return. And it became clear from a comment in the audience and later comments on social media that really for claimants, restitution as a term, as a concept, imported so much and was very, very important, and return didn't really step up to the mark there. And it was this idea of the link with justice and the return and all of the sort of the historical harm that had been done, the continuing harm, and how that was being unravelled through this process of restitution, which the suggestion was that the word return wasn't really doing. And so this experience really struck me at the time, and it stuck with me in terms of the importance of that terminology. And I have to say now, I very much adopt the terminology of restitution in the context of the work I do in Nazi era claims for Nazi era cultural objects. And I tend to use the terminology of repatriation in the context of claims made against museums for objects taken during colonial times and punitive expeditions and other claims as well. But I'm going to explain how I got to that point and also the complicating factors, because I don't think it's a straightforward situation with the language that's used. So the outline of my talk is that I'll talk about the plethora of terminology that's being used, but then think about the terms of restitution, repatriation, return. What is actually happening as is it the end result? Is it the process? Is it a transfer? And if so, a transfer of what exactly? I'll then talk about what I suggested, the need to avoid presumptions and presupposing outcomes when talking about challenges to the status quo in museums. And that's really what I'm suggesting is a focus on responses at the expense of actually thinking about how to deal with claims and challenges to the status quo in an empathetic, dialogic and respectful manner. And that I see as central to dealing with any kind of challenges that are made. So in terms of the terminology, the plethora of terminology, I've already talked about return, restitution, repatriation, but other terms have been brought in recent years. Cultural restitution, for one, reparation, reunification, rematriation as well, rematriation. All of these add to the complexity of the situation. And not least as well, the interplay between the legal aspect of any act or transfer of an object from a museum, and also the perceptions of the process of that and the people who were involved with that. And in terms of the difficulties and the loose terminology, this was acknowledged in the relatively recent Arts Council England guidance on restitution and repatriation, where they say that the terms restitution and repatriation do not have any strict legal definition as far as museum practice is concerned, but they tend to be reused rather loosely, and in essence have traditionally described the process of returning cultural material to its original owners in the case of restitution, or its place of origin in the case of repatriation. Now, whilst they say that it has no strict legal definition in this context of museum practice, on the international legal stage, there has been sort of clear indications and a lot of thought given about the terminology of restitution and repatriation and return. And I'm going to touch upon some of these now. In the context of restitution, we see this in the Intergovernmental Committee, the very, very long title for the return of cultural property to the countries of origin, or it's restitution in the case of illicit appropriation. And reading back some work by Lyndall Prott in a book, Witnesses to History as well, we see that this was added very specifically as linked in the title because return of cultural property to the countries of origin, the return there, but restitution having that illicit element to it, the illicit appropriation. So it's when objects have left their countries of origin illegally, according to the relevant national legislation. And here it mentions specifically the 1970 UNESCO Convention, which of course is dealing with situations where objects, or this process of return of objects that were stolen from a museum, for example, with an inventory, and where a claim is made by another country specifically for the return of those and that process. But in terms of restitution, Kowalski talks about it being the violation of the prohibition of theft and pillage imposed by the binding law. So very much a response, this is the international approach, the response to that illicit activity or violation of some rule that's in place. And its aim is very much to restore the parties to their original position. And this comes as well, and we see this notion of restitution in private law rather than international law. We see it as this restitutio in integrum, this idea of trying to restore people as far as possible to the position they were in, but for what they have experienced. So undoing an unjust enrichment, certainly in private law. And Craig Forrest and Kowalski also talk about the violation of a legal norm or prohibition. So there's this illicit element to it, the illegality in a sense of what has happened and the trying to sort that out and put people back into that position. Moving though to more museum practice, and this was the guidance that was in place in 2000, the Museums and Galleries Commission, which was one of the previous guises of the work that's carried out by ACE now. And in the glossary of terms, it was said that the return of an object from a museum collection to a party found to have a prior and continuing relationship with the object, such as a valid title or traditional guardianship, which is seen to override the claims of the holding museum. Now, what's really interesting about this particular definition is not the need specifically for a contravention of a law or theft or an illicit appropriation. Here, it's about the fact that somebody has that pre-existing relationship and it continues. And here, using the terminology of valid title or traditional guardianship circumvents that need for that legal wrong that has happened in the past. And a valid title may indicate that an object has been taken from somebody. The current possessor of the museum might have a strict legal title because over time someone in possession can have a better entitlement than the original owner after the passage of time. So we have the Limitation Act of 1980, and what that means is that after a period of 6 years from the first good faith purchase, then at that point not only is the claim brought to an end that the original owner would have against the current possessor, but more importantly, the original person's title legal title is extinguished. So it does two things, does the Limitation Act. Now that's the 1980 Act. The one that was enforced before was the 1939 Act. And that was even stricter. It didn't even account of the need for any good faith purchase to start time running. It would even start to run against a thief. And so in many situations, a museum or current holder will have a strict legal title to something. They are the owners in law. But there's this concept of valid title, which we see in the ICOM code as well, that idea that it's a title that is not based on the legal situation, but it could be on that prior continuing entitlement that might be on ethical grounds. But it also includes traditional guardianship here, and that relationship that may exist, which is different from the legal title that, as I said, the museum may now hold. And so I think this is quite an interesting, complicating definition of restitution, which shifts away from that strictly legal act, or that rather the illegal act, and has instead shifted towards that idea that there's more of an ethical relationship or continuing relationship with the object than a strict legal one. This here doesn't have any implication of wrongdoing as such, but that there's a continuing entitlement. It doesn't address the issue at all about whether there was any wrong by which the original person who had the relationship with the object lost possession of it. But I'm going to come back to that, because what we see in other situations is this notion of the wrong itself. So Anna Wodolczak, in her work, talks about restitution rather than being the remedy, it's being the cessation of a wrong. And here she's talking about an international wrongful act, and it's the bringing to an end of that. She suggests that this interpretation is reinforced by the lack of application of time limits to the restitution process and its application to third-party states and within states as well. So this idea that it's not about the museum, it's not a question of law and continuing legal entitlement of the original owners, but it's necessarily about not applying those time limits strictly, thinking back to what Leggett was saying in terms of the valid title rather than the legal title. And we see this notion of restitution as well as being more than the legal situation in the Sarsfield report, to which Anne has already referred today. And in that report, they suggest that what restitution means is it's an act. The gesture of restitution is the recognition of the illegitimacy of the property that one had previously claimed ownership of. As a consequence, the act of restitution attempts to put things back in order. So again, this notion of restitution is the act of putting things back, or trying to return things to how they were, and putting them into proper harmony, as they say. To openly speak of restitution, they say, is to speak of justice, rebalancing, recognition, restoration, and reparation. So these are all words as well, reparations, that's often used as well as another element in the discussion about restitution, repatriation, return. But also they suggest a pathway towards establishing new cultural relations, and of course within that context of the relational ethics, or upon the ethical relation that they talk about here. And we see this notion of attempting to put things back, putting things right, speaking of justice and rebalancing in Alexander Herman's recent work of restitutionist in Restitution, the Return of Cultural Artifacts, where he talks of the restitution being the return of cultural material to an individual, group, or nation, with the overall aim of doing justice for a past or ongoing wrong. And in many ways that draws together as well what Anna Wodolczak was talking about in that kind of continuing wrong and the cessation of that. He suggests in his work that restitution does not provide the solution itself, but one of the bases for a solution, the establishment of a new, equitable and sustainable relations between those involved. And he describes the restitution paradigm as operating by collapsing the expanse of time between an artifact's original removal and the present as well. But what we've seen in recent times is actually the terminology of cultural restitution entering the lexicon as well. And I'm still getting to grips with exactly what this means, whether it's about restitution to the culture of origin or restitution of the culture. It's sometimes used in the context of the digital restitution as well, and the information that's contained, and the whole process as well. And I think in that sense, if cultural restitution is very much linked as well with the ongoing relationships, then that is an interesting dimension to add as well. Because in some way that can ensure that stories are told, and that when something is returned, it's not the end of the story. It's also about the ongoing relationships. But whether the word restitution on its own, with that origin of returning, of restoring to the original position, whether that actually is sufficient on its own, and whether it needs cultural to add that dimension to it, is one that I think is an interesting avenue to look at in the near future. We've also talked in that sense about cultural restitution, the concern as well about the digital heritage as well, and the digital information. And in Pavis and Wallace's report, or their response to the Sarsabwell report, they urged caution regarding digitisation projects and the risk of undermining the new relational ethics in the approach that was suggested. So in the Sarsabwell report, they talked about the radical practice of sharing. But as the authors of the response pointed out, the public domain, open access are very much aspects of colonial thinking, and so that will perpetuate the power imbalance, the issues of authority, of power, of takings as well, and continuing, and the risk of continuing wrongs. Certainly, if return or transfer of the physical object, and arguably the ownership rights as well at that time, if that is on condition of retaining access to the digital heritage, making copies, having that and making that available to everybody, then again, that isn't a dialogic response. It again perpetuates those power imbalances. Am I okay for time at the moment? Is that, yeah? Okay, that's great. So in terms of repatriation, thinking about the terminology of repatriation, the traditional everyday definition is about the return or restoration of money, historical artifacts to their country of origin, very much about the patrie, the place of origin, country of origin. And again, in terms of the etymology, it's 1610s from late Latin, meaning return or restoration to one's country. So it tends to be used to that notion of returning to a country or to community, for example, claims made by indigenous communities. Now, returning to Kowalski, he used it in a very specific context, though. He talked about restoration where there had been a change in territorial dimension. So the idea was that you weren't returning it strictly to the original state from which it was taken, but it was after borders had changed, post-conflict usually, there you were returning it to a different place within what had been part of a country. And so in that sense, he was talking about it to the place, to the homeland, if you like. But again, in the Select Committee report of 2000, they talked about repatriation, about referring to the return of an object of cultural patrimony to a party found to be the true owner or traditional guardians, or to their descendants. So repatriation, in contrast to restitution, which was seen very much to owners and much more about property-based and property rights, here it was about true owners, again, that idea perhaps of valid title rather than legal title, and traditional guardians as well, so trying recognising that notion of guardianship as well. So thinking now in terms of what has been described in the past as the more neutral terminology of return, I wanted to explore whether it is in fact neutral, all-encompassing, or in fact a euphemism. So in the 1986 Intergovernmental Committee guidelines, they talked about return being where objects left prior to the crystallization of laws. So this was a situation they talked about usually in the colonial context, is how it was described. But the idea was that this was not about return in response to a legal wrong, which is what restitution seemed to presuppose, but instead it was about a situation where there weren't any laws in place which prevented something from happening, and yet it was felt that return was appropriate there. So again, Kowalski talked about referring to situations where it was left in during colonial times, where a cultural or where a cultural object is illegally exported from a state. And both Lyndall Prott in her earlier work and subsequently Janet Alf and Ian Smith, they referred to it as a more neutral term. And it was in fact in that guise that I was making use of it a number of years ago. But we see as well in the glossary of terms returning to the 2000 guidelines that it refers to the transfer of an object from a museum collection to a requesting party following a decision at the highest level of approval within the museum, generally its governing body, which is what would have to happen in restitution and repatriation. But it was seen as, again, of being in the context of much more of an ex gratia nature, it not being required because there had been an infraction of a legal provision many years ago, but instead it was about a decision perhaps on purely ethical grounds. And certainly how Jeanette Greenfield talks about it in her book is that return, she suggests, is part of a wider movement of cultural treasures and need not only mean restitution in the sense of reparation for wrongful taking. So again, this notion that it's not about the trying to remedy an injustice. It's not about that wrongful act and trying to put people back in that original position. Instead, she talks about it being part of restoration, reinstatement, rejuvenation, and in fact, reunification. And we can see this in examples of efforts made to return objects to be in the same place that an element of it is, or for example, the V&A, the return of the Eros's head to the sarcophagus from which it was taken. I'll talk more about the nature of that return later, but this idea of reunifying objects, we see it as well, not in the repatriation context and claims against museums, but I've seen it in the reports of the Export Reviewing Committee in the UK in terms of taking into account whether or not something might be reinstated. So some choir stalls in Germany were actually sort of let through the system and were not classified as national treasures, or they didn't have to go through the process, as long and laborious a process, because of the recognition that actually they were going to be put back in place and reunified, and that cultural value really there was more important than trying to keep it in the UK. But having looked at the sort of the three main players in the terminology, we also see a new term used, or a more recent term. It is used in certain communities, rematriation. But this also, the recent return from the National Museum Scotland of the Nishimuru Memorial Pole shows this notion of rematriation, where it was to a matrilineal society, and that this was seen as being far more appropriate in terms than repatriation to the patrie. And we see this notion as well of dealing with things as cultural matrimony. Sharon Hecker has suggested that cultural matrimony might be an approach to resolving heritage disputes. In an Institute of Art and Law blog a number of years ago, she talked that a matrimonial approach would emphasise a shared cultural heritage that enables objects to be part of a transnational relationship. And a matrimonial approach opens up fertile new potential for trust and synergy. And in fact, this links in some ways, although I try not to sort of link it directly as a feminist approach in that sense, but the notion of care as well, and thinking about responding to claims through the ethics of care and as an empathetic, respectful and dialogic approach has similarities with this notion here of a matrimonial one. But I'm wanting to think about restitution, repatriation, return of what? Is it the thing itself, or is it the intangible elements here? Is it permanent or is it temporary? And we saw in Emmanuel Macron's speech in Burkina Faso, he talked about temporary or definitive restitution. In the Sarsapwa report, they emphasised that the importance of restitution and the transfer of ownership had a symbolic impact, and therefore the definitive or permanent restitution was the important thing rather than the temporary one. But is it the transfer of the object itself or the transfer of the culture, the return of the object? Is it about transferring property rights? And when I talk about property rights, of course, that's not just ownership rights. It could be the possession of that. So the recent cultural partnerships that have been announced with the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum, they're described as renewable partnerships with the V&A, but it just seemed to be cultural partnerships when it came to the British Museum. Is this restitution or repatriation return, even though it's on a temporary scale, does the transfer of full ownership rights, is that necessary for it to count as restitution, repatriation, return? And is it the transfer of the entitlement to choose how it's used, for it to be unconditional? So that notion of the transfer of the legal title to it. Anne mentioned the temporary nature of loans, and the fact that subsequently laws were passed to rectify that and actually make it a permanent one. But is there restitution or return at the point at which it is merely loaned, albeit it's on an ongoing basis and will be renewed over time? Or is the idea of restitution and repatriation very much about the transfer of not just the thing, but the information about it, the digital rights to it, all of those sorts of things? Or is it more about the process itself and the dialogue that happens, and the fact that over time, collaborations build up? And to my mind, the terms restitution, repatriation, return, one naturally thinks about the act of transfer and not necessarily of those ongoing partnerships, of the collaboration that can be done. And so therefore, in some ways, the language is stifling that sort of very innovative way in which things are being dealt with. So, for example, where there was actually a transfer from the Gilbert collection of a gold ewer to Turkey, an artist, A.D. Chock, was commissioned to create an artwork, a gold piece to replace that, and the story remains there. So whilst there was a transfer, one might say repatriation there, return, nevertheless, something was left behind, and that seems to be absent from the terminology of restitution and repatriation. Maybe cultural repatriation will import that, but whether that's going to be a sort of a widespread interpretation of that terminology, we have yet to see. So briefly, some observations. A distinction then in the terminology between to whom something is returned and why something is returned. So we see this in the Arts Council guidance and the MGC guidance of 2000. So it's whether it's returned to an owner or to the place, but also thinking the distinction about why something is returned. So in restitution, very much about the wrong that was done that is being unravelled, and trying to avoid the notion of perpetuating those power imbalances. But I think there's a risk of a presumption of return or repatriation, restitution as the act of transfer. By talking in terms of the outcome, if it's understood by many as the outcome, the risk is that it perpetuates an apparent imbalance, demonstrates in some ways a paternalistic care. If there's a presumption, we must give everything back, we must do that. Instead, it's about a museum or advocates not presupposing that return is what everybody wants, but also thinking about listening to, expressing the view about what the communities for whom the object is important, from whom it originated, how they want to react, whether that is about accepting it or whether it is about allowing it to remain where it is, but with a narrative, with views expressed and control over how it is displayed. Because for some communities, having an object foisted on them, here it is, we want to give it back, may be a burden. And so therefore it is very much about a dialogue as a process. So that's where talking about restitution or return or repatriation can mask the fact that it is a process. It's about people coming along in some cases and challenging the status quo, saying we used to have responsibility for that object, it was taken from us, or we lost responsibility, but it has so much importance for this reason or that reason. And so therefore this notion of challenging, of a dialogue, rather than focusing on the potential outcome, I think is a way forward with this. And so the notion of responding to challenges to the status quo in an empathetic, respectful and dialogical way, and to think about that as a framework rather than thinking about the terminology of restitution, repatriation, return, because not least I think it's doing a disservice to the very many legitimate claims that are being made or challenges that are being made, because if we just presuppose that everything's going to be returned, then that can, I think, stifle any attempts that need to be made to reform the law to allow or to give the power to return where that's appropriate, and to provide the space really for dialogue to happen, for challenges to be heard. Because in many ways, if the risk is, or the concern is, that there's an emptying of museums, then that stifles any chance there is of reforming the National Museum statutes, which would allow in the future, hopefully, opportunities to return on a permanent rather than a temporary basis. And so rather than having a number of cultural partnerships that happen over many years, instead having a sort of a permanent means of transferring objects from those collections. And I suggest that in many ways the language of restitution, repatriation, return has a role to play in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this, Charlotte. We will now head to Gracia's presentation. Gracia will be presenting on navigating the complexities of cultural heritage restitution, a post-colonial perspective on Belgium and Congo. Welcome, Gracia. Hope
Thank you so much.
Any team's issues are resolved now.
Can you move to the other slide, please?
Yes. Thank
you so much for this outstanding event, and I am really glad to be here in order to share my perspective on questions regarding restitution of cultural heritage. So this will be actually our main point. We will be discussing about how restitution is actually a long history of domination, and it doesn't start with the discourse of Emmanuel Macron. We will see how the legal framework is articulated and which advancements have been made recently. So we will take a look on, how different approach are constructed in Belgium and Congo, and how those approach are negotiating or are conflicting, and we will see how the restitution, the return restitution. Yes, I like how we complete each other. We will see how it have been interpreted in Congo since the last long-term loan of the Suku Kakungu Mosque in Congo during the visit of the King Philip in Congo. The next one. Okay, so restitution, it's a long history of domination. So I really like to begin with the history, because it helped to put a spotlight on diverse actors that have been involved in the debate during years and years, and that's actually helped us to see how the debate is evolving, or it's going in a virtuous circle. So in 1878, there were Nekuko, who was a chief in Boma, that asked a restitution of the Donkey Sinkondi, the statue just right here. And it was actually, on my point of view, the first time that a political leader, because he's a traditional chief, political leader, asked for restitution of its attribute of power. And there were also a demand for restitution of cultural heritage during the construction of the Museum of Indigenous Life in Leopoldville during the colonization. That was a museum constructed by by Jeanne Tambou and Marcel Maquet, who they were just, you know, art lover, and they wanted to construct a museum for indigenous, for Congolese people living in Congo. So actually, the 1950 was a tremendous momentum, because cultural heritage has acquired the political narrative, a strong political narrative, especially on the perspective of Belgians. Belgians define and they justificated their presence in Congo based on the protection of cultural heritage. So they depicted Congolese as, you know, unable to protect their cultural heritage. So they just justificated the mission they has to protect the Congolese culture. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yes. So during the negotiation for independence, there were diverse tapestry of diverse and dynamic actors that have been involved in negotiation. We have the claim of Kasavubu and Emery Patrice Lumumba. And yeah, during the round table, restitution have been also a crucial claim. And we have also to single out the powerful character in the debate of restitution, who is the President Mobutu, who actually succeeded to connect cultural heritage and African dignity, and he actually put the cultural heritage in his policy, his governance policy, in the Manifeste de l'Ancélé, which actually leads all his charisma and his purpose to construct and to build a strong African nation. So after independence, actually, we see that it's important to point out the role of Afro-descendants in Belgium and in France that have helped to put restitution of cultural heritage on the political agenda here in Europe. This narrative is it's not, you know, more discussed in the academic sphere, but for us, especially the activism of Mwazulu Diabanza, for instance, it was for the first time that an activist entered in the Musée de Quai Branly and try to demonstrate the force of colonialism in taking back the object. And when the curator asked him, why are you doing this? And he said that you can't ask for a thief to, you know, you can't negotiate with the thief. So for me, that act actually was demonstrate how the colonial violence of extractivism look at it was actually absolutely the mirroring the mirroring of the colonial violence, and that is for me important to show that that's parallelism, that example. So there is also here in Belgium the role of of the global movement of George Floyd, that stems the Commission on colonial colonial violence. So there were also the visits of King Philip that present his deepest regret to Congo for all that the Leopold II and the Belgians have done in Congo, and it has an historical like significance, but in the practical way, Congolese are not seeing it as strong enough. But on my perspective, this event too helped to go forward, to help a certain opening of debate. To the next slide, please. So here we can see two different events. The one occurred in 1980, and the other one is so recent, in 2022. So here you can see how restitution has been, depicted as a gift, because when Mobutu asked for restitution during that period, he just received 114 cultural artifacts as a gift by Belgium. So here also you can see recent event when for instance, the King Philip came with the Sukukakungu mask. It was not a restitution itself, but it was actually a long-term loan. But yes, there is actually a similarity in these two events, because it demonstrates how we are so far in moving forward with that paradigm of aid, paradigm of paternalism, actually. So can move to the about the legal framework. Yes, as you can see here, I can't, detail everything here, because there is so much thing to talk about here. But you can see here, for instance, the Hague Convention, the convention that are combating illicit trafficking of cultural heritage, the UNIDROIT Convention. Yes, but all those instruments, plus the soft international instrument, did not actually respond in a concrete way to the restitution of colonial cultural heritage that have been taken during the colonization. But in my perspective, for instance, the Hague Convention helped to construct a sort of international customary founded on the right to restitute, because before that period of time, there were, a certain philosophy of legitimacy of booty of war here, constructed by Grotius. But that is actually another manner of thinking, because it was not the same perspective regarding to, politic of extractivism in Africa, for instance, as Dan Hicks can demonstrate it, that it was, in the perspective of taking everything, taking every culture, and yes. So for me, it's tremendous to point out that there is actually a different way to perceive the convention regarding Western country and the convention regarding African countries. So in Belgium, to be concrete, what helped to evolve in the debate of restitution of cultural heritage, it's that law that have been voted by the parliament chamber here in Belgium. It's the law that is recognizing the inalienability of cultural objects linked to the colonial past of Belgian states, and that established a legal framework for restitution and return of cultural heritage. Right now, we will diving in what is actually concretely the Belgian approach of restitution of cultural heritage. The next slide, please. All right. So before we detail everything about the Belgian approach, let us see how, different media depict and present the Belgian approach. Here you can see how the Belgian approach is presented as a systematic approach which avoids restitution on case by case. This actually is to respond to the French policy that adopted the lex specialis to the restitution of 26 objects in Benin, for instance, and the Omar El Haj Saber also. So here in Belgium, they think about how to question all the cultural objects acquired during the colonization, but what is uncomfortable with that kind of narrative is that they were just the one who decide and define what is the criteria of restituability. So we can go to the next slide, please. All right. So actually, the law that recognize alienability of restitution in Belgium helped to open a debate on restitution of cultural heritage, and it has a significant symbolic significance because, before there were not even a place to debate, there were not even a place to ask for restitution. But now we know that Congo, Burundi, or Rwanda, they can formulate a demand for restitution based on this law. But before, there were a strict deadlock about that, and we found that it's helped to open debate on restitution. So what is uncomfortable is that they define the legitimacy, and that's actually, on my perspective, it's a continuation of a symbolic violence against the former colonizer, because you can't define what is legitimate or not, as a colonization itself is a coercive environment. So And what is peculiar in this law is that they just they single out just cultural objects held by public institution, federal institution. For instance, the Royal Belgian Institution of Natural Science and the African Museum, Ancient Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren. And they didn't include the restitution of archives and human remains. And last, they tried to define in a sort of artificial way return versus restitution. Return the restitution as, you know, a restitution of material cultural heritage versus return that can be in non-material material way. So let's go to the next slide. So on my perspective, I find out and I observe some criticism on this this bill of law. First of all, it's actually denounced the European-centric approach of that kind of restitution, because it have been debated here in Belgium without a consultation of the three countries. And the approach, it seems to not be open to community perspective, and it's framed the bilateral treaties that will be discussed in the future, because they already target institutions, they already target the restitutability criteria. So there is no actually so much space to a debate, to an ethical exchange on the restitution in the global way. So also, there is actually a symbolic violence that persists between the different actors that are involved in the debate, and we will see it a little bit later in the next slide, how there is the different image and interpretation of that restitution. Next slide, please. So, in brief, there is also a Congolese approach of restitution of cultural heritage, even if it's a certain mirror of the Belgian approach, because yes, there is a colonial history background in a dependence, a dependence of Congolese policy on the Belgian one. But what is particular here is that the Congolese respond to the goodwill of Belgium to open debate on restitution by nominating a commission that operates that will operate in the next the next step. And the Minister of Culture has solicited Belgium to finance the support of the decree. That decree actually that implement and accept to involve and to be, to be involved in restitution of cultural heritage by nominating different scientific and different administrator that will work in this purpose. And also there is actually the programme d'action that have been voted that put in the central strategic governance of Congo the cultural heritage and the construction of different like investment to support the culture, to construct museum. But unfortunately, there is nothing that have been done concretely in the cultural policy until now. But we are waiting to see the new member of government to see how they will implement actually this this endeavor. Next slide, please. So here we will be analyzing how the restitution of Kakungu mask have created different interpretation between the actors involved, because I am working on restitution with a kind of dialectical view, because I am analyzing how actors in Belgium are perceiving restitution and how actually Congolese also are perceiving restitution, to have a certain complete narrative on diverse perspective. So here you can see a beautiful picture of political actors that are smiling and are working together. So the King Philip, when he came with this Kakungu mask in Congo, it was, as he want to communicate a stable diplomatic relationship between the DRC and Belgium, and how he's supporting the new visage of the National Museum of the Democratic Republic of Congo, even if it was supported by the South Korea. But yes, and it was also it demonstrated the historic gesture that set a certain tone for a new dynamic, new relationship between Congo and Belgium. So the next. So here you can see a certain response to that official narrative or restitution, official representation of restitution and the visit of King Philip in Congo. You can see just right here how the rhetoric of injustice gain its place by demonstrating how the selection of the Kakungu mask was not was not a common consentment. It was not. It was a unilateral choice of Belgium, and this right here, this picture right here of the artist Meshak Kadima, a Congolese artist and activist, it expressed how there is an uncomfortable sentiment in Congolese perception of that visit, because that also trigger question about reparation. So you are bringing this mask, and how can you come here, visit us, just bringing one mask? And what about the question of reparation? What about a serious concern about the responsibility of Belgium to respond to those accusations of colonial crime. So, and just under the caricature of Kadima, you can see how social media actually try to denounce in saying that the mask that Philippe brought in Congo was a fake, but the director of the National Museum responded to this, communicating that there is different Kakungu mask and there is masculine Kakungu mask, there is feminine Kakungu mask, and this one was asserted that it was not a fake but an authentic one, and that act actually demonstrates also how young people in Congo are involved and they are really interested in those questions of restitution. So the next slide, please. So here you can see also how the Kakungu mask actually have been used as a norm of legitimation of the Fabrice Kavabioko, who is the contested chief of Suku community. So you can see him here, just the picture, the big picture here. He's with Christophe Mbosso, the president of National Assembly. So for him, this restitution too, he used this as a political tool to legitimate his governance, his power vis-a-vis the Suku community, and that also bring about sentiment of conflict for those who are positioned behind Many Congo, who is attested as a true traditional chief. So here we wanted just to make you figure out that the restitution can bring reconciliation, but it can also be a source of conflict. So it's important also to analyze it in that way. The next slide, please. All right, so what's next? On my perspective, I analyze restitution as a new way actually to affirm neocolonialism, and it's important, it's tremendous to articulate it in a collaborative way. And how do we balancing community participation, government participation, and diaspora participation, because they are all important actors that has their place on the table of negotiation. So how do we negotiate with diverse actors that have to be on the table of negotiation? So in my thesis, I am trying to figure out how to articulate the colony restitution. The colony is a concept developed by Stéphane Dufour, who tried to demonstrate how to open Western epistemology to other sort of epistemology. So on my perspective, I want to figure out how can we bring the knowledge of community sources in the debate, in the process of restitution, in the study on the provenance study too. So there is a way to discuss about all those issues. And thank you so much for your attention and for your remark. Thank you.